Boris Johnson has been returned as Britain's Prime Minister with a convincing majority, and what he says is a mandate to get Brexit done. And for more on the election result, we are joined by Political Campaign Director Mark Neeham. Mark, good morning to you. Did you predict this major majority win?
I didn't see the majority being this big. I thought he would win. Certainly Labour were not in contention to win, but I didn't think he would win this big. But it's certainly a mandate to deliver what he's promised in the election campaign.
Like, looking at it from an Australian perspective, it's not that dissimilar to Scott Morrison. He's just come in and Boris Johnson's absolutely got a smacking mandate majority.
Absolutely, and if you look at where he's gained those seats, the Midlands, the North, seats that for 100 years have returned Labour MPs, but not just returned them, but returned them with 60, 70% of the vote, that have now elected a Conservative MP for the first time in history. He's redrawn the political map of the UK. The Conservative Party is now the party of the working person, the working class, and those northern industrial towns, which is incredible.
It is incredible, and we're saying it's the biggest win since Margaret Thatcher in 1987 and the lowest for Labor since the 1930s. We were just asking Laura Jades, who's in London this evening, her time, that who is going to replace Jeremy Corbyn, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question, because you'd think, oh, we're going to move back to the centre ground. Obviously, we need to move ourselves back to the centre to go back to win back those voters that we've lost. But if you look who's around Corbyn, his deputies, his key lieutenants, the key people in the executive, the key people through the country, they're all his supporters. They're not the Blairites that were there in the 90s. They are these radical left-wing people. So it's a major issue for the Labour Party. I've got a lot of friends in the Labour Party who joined in the 80s and 90s who were, more mainstream, centre-left, moderate people who've been purged out. But, he's purged out moderate members of Parliament. He's purged out people in key positions in the party. So it's a real issue for the Labour Party, how they regroup and move forward.
Do you see this as a bit of a collective message of our best way forward out of this, years now of frustration, of inaction, of no direction, is to put Boris Johnson in and at least do something, even if I didn't believe in Brexit? I
think so. I think, there was a clear message there. We will get this done. And it's 3 years since the referendum. The British people made a decision and instructed their members of Parliament to implement that decision, and for 3 years they frustrated it. And you can't get away with that. If you can't ignore a democratic decision, whether you like it or dislike it, of the British people, and think you can get away with it. There's also the fact that there is now stability, there is certainty. Whether you agree or disagree, you know where the country's going. It's good for investment, it's good for business, it's good for people to move on. People are, my family, my friends, they're just sick and tired of discussing.
Well, no one's been talking about the economy, no one's been talking about homelessness, no one's been talking about any issues, have they?
Absolutely. Nothing, all these key issues, the NHS, law and order, there's big issues that need dealing with in the UK, but no legislation's been going through Parliament, no business has been discussed. Brexit has dominated. And people are just fed up of it and want to get on with it.
There has been talk, though, as well, that a lot of the votes were a rejection of Jeremy Corbyn as opposed to a win for Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
And obviously there's been a lot of talk about him potentially lying, avoiding interviews, hiding in fridges and so forth. But, clearly he won with a massive majority since we've seen the 1980s.
He did. There's those accusations that he didn't do interviews, particularly with people like Andrew Neil, on the BBC, but look, he's been in town centres up and down the country. Town centres and streets, knocking on doors, meeting voters face to face. He's not hidden from the voters, and he's certainly, just because he hasn't done one interview with one journalist doesn't mean to say he's been hiding. Yes, it is a rejection of Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, no leader in the UK is going to get elected if you've got issues with anti-Semitic views in your party. If you're seen as a sympathiser to terrorists, which obviously is supporting IRA terrorists in the 80s and 90s, Hamas and Hezbollah more recently, you're not going to get elected. Yes, it is a rejection of Corbyn, but it's also the fact that let's move on, let's get on with this and move the country forward.
Let's go to Glasgow and Edinburgh, and they might be rolling out their copies of Braveheart, because it was a good night for Scotland. But those talking about independence have got to remember that it needs to get through Westminster. Boris Johnson's got an enormous mandate. So any decision of significance has to come out of there.
It does. It does. And obviously, my vote is cast in a Scottish constituency. We're registered in East Lothian, so it's a real issue for ourselves. Yeah, the SNP had a good night last night, but the Conservative Party held on to 6 seats. They're bigger than Labour. They're bigger than the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. And it's not a big margin over those. But look, the Conservative Party is the opposition there. There's going to be intense pressure from the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government for a second independence referendum. But as you say, Westminster has to grant that. What the country doesn't need is another divisive campaign. And the first Scottish independence referendum was incredibly divisive, split communities in half. So did Brexit. The country actually needs to be brought together, and you're going to see a lot of investment from London and Westminster up into Scotland, into some of those communities. We've spoken about obviously Boris Johnson, the national campaign, but I think we need to mention the actual campaign that was run by Conservative Central Office. Yes, the leader's 1 point, but a guy called Darren Mott, National Director of Campaigning, and Australian Isaac Levido, who went over there to help run the campaign, have done a fantastic job running those marginal seats against the Liberal Democrats and Labour.
Okay, so we've waited over 3 years for Brexit to happen. We've got 2 months for it to happen, and the Conservatives are clearly in for 5 years. What are we going to see in the next year? Because we've got that transition period until December 2020.
We have, and obviously there's been a lot of, obviously if we can get through, obviously Parliament resumes next week. It's pretty quick. It's not 2 weeks of counting postal votes, and the results are in. All the seats are declared now. Parliament resumes next week. He'll introduce that legislation, the withdrawal agreement, and then 2 years of negotiations for a free trade agreement. It's the beginning of, it's the end of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the end.
No, I know.
This process. But look, in terms of policies, obviously the Conservative Party took forward, obviously what's called a One Nation agenda. One Nation, very different in the UK to here. One Nation means bringing people together and supporting communities where they need it. 20,000 more police officers, 40 new hospitals to be built. It's a big agenda for the next 5 years. I think one important piece of legislation will be to repeal what's called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which is the legislation that stopped Boris Johnson calling an election over the past few months, and also extending the vote beyond 15 years to British citizens overseas. So.
And it does, look, it's a great catch cry, and they've done very well to get to power, get Brexit done. But look, I just alluded to it with Laura and just mentioned it, just changing number plates. There's so much to be done functionally in this change.
It is, it's incredible, a massive job. Number plates, driver's licenses. I just renewed my son's passport, and it's still the burgundy European Union passport, but the word European Union has been removed already from those passports. They're going to become blue. Just the amount of regulations that come out of Brussels, from everything from the size of a bed pillow to the size of bananas, and what can be eaten and sold in markets across the UK. It's a massive issue. Just making all those European regulations part of the British legislation, British regulations as well.
Very daunting indeed. It's going to take a long time. And just finally, how are the polls? Because it was the first election in December for around 100 years. And so I think the polls were just a little bit less than 2017.
That's right. That's right. I mean, obviously a December election. It's pretty cold over there at the moment. It was raining on polling day. Usually people like to go, usually elections are held in May, June. So it's, spring, start of summer. But people turned out in big numbers. I think a lot of Labour voters stayed at home, but obviously the exit poll was spot on when polls closed yesterday. So
good to see some polls actually correct.
Yeah, and I think just from a common sense point of view, there's a huge sigh of relief. I think for a lot of people to think, well, okay, as you mentioned before, we do have some direction, we do have some definitive things we can look to for the future.
That's right. That's right, and obviously Britain wants to look outwards. Yes, the European Union will still be a very big part of Britain's foreign policy agenda, but can now strike free trade deals around the world. The US, Australia will be first cabs off the rank. So important to look globally for the UK and to move forward.